His barn was on fire, his cattle scattered in the freezing night, and yet Caleb refused to walk away from the land his father left behind. Today, AT Kindness Audio brings you a story of grit and legacy. It's about a young cowboy, barely 20, who inherits a struggling ranch and faces powerful land barons determined to crush him. But will courage alone be enough to protect what he loves most? The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass as Caleb Whitmore stepped down from his horse. Jasper let out a tired snort, his graying mane catching the breeze like an old flag still flying. Caleb ran a gloved hand along the saddle horn before looking up at the weathered sign that hung lopsided from 2 rusted nails. Willow Creek Ranch. The paint had peeled, the wood had split, but it still stood, just like his father had. His boots crunched against the dirt path leading to the house. Dust swirled up with each step, clinging to his jeans, his coat, his memory. The place looked smaller than he remembered. The fence leaned in too many places. The barn sagged to the right, like it had given up halfway through a sentence. But none of that mattered. This was his father's land. Hold on to it, son, no matter what comes. That voice hadn't left him, not through the sleepless nights out on the trail, not through the towns he drifted through trying to forget the silence of the hospital room where Thomas Whitmore had taken his final breath. He stood for a moment outside the front door, hand on the knob, not turning it. The house wasn't just old, it was sacred. This was where his father had sat every morning with a cup of coffee and a cigarette, watching the sun come up over the ridge. It was where his mother's voice once hummed through the open windows before illness took her away too soon. Caleb had spent summers here mending fences and winters huddled by the fire, his father reading scripture and dog-eared Western novels. The screen door creaked open with a wheeze and a slap. The air inside was dry, heavy with time. Dust covered the shelves, the chairs, the mantel. A blanket still rested on the couch, folded in the neat, squared-off way his father always insisted on. Caleb set his duffel down and opened the windows. Sunlight spilled in like an old friend, and for a moment he stood still, eyes closed, letting it warm his face. Later that afternoon, he walked the land. 50 acres wasn't much by rancher standards, but it was enough. A thin stream trickled along the western edge of the property, its waters low from the long summer. Grass waved gently in the wind, golden and dry. He paused by the barn, running his hand across the rough boards. Inside, the old stall doors hung crooked, and the scent of hay, manure, and oil hung in the air. It wasn't broken, it was just waiting. By late afternoon, he rode Jasper into Dry Creek. The town hadn't grown. If anything, it had settled deeper into its own stillness. The streets were dusty, the buildings unchanged. At the edge of Main Street stood the old diner, Millie's Place. The sign still tilted sideways, one light flickering even in daylight. He tied Jasper outside and stepped in. A bell above the door gave a dry jingle. Inside, the smell of fried food and strong coffee mixed with the faint trace of something sweet. Maybe apple pie. Maggie Dawson stood behind the counter, hands deep in soap suds. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose braid, apron stained with flour. She looked up, and her hands froze. "Caleb Whitmore," she said slowly, like tasting the words before letting them go. "Back from wherever you went?" He gave a small nod. "Just passing through," he lied. She smirked, wiping her hands. "That what you're calling it?" They talked for a while. Nothing deep. Weather, cattle prices, who had moved away and who had married who. But underneath it all, there was a warmth that hadn't quite died between them. She slid a plate of cornbread his way without asking, and filled his mug with fresh coffee. It was almost evening when he stepped outside again. The shadows had lengthened, and the air held a chill. He was untying Jasper when a dark pickup pulled in slow, wheels crunching gravel. The door opened, and a man stepped out. Black boots, silver belt buckle, cowboy hat pulled low. Caleb recognized him before the man even spoke. Royce Turner. "I heard you were back," Royce said, voice smooth but tight. "Didn't think you'd stay long." Caleb didn't answer, just stared. Royce looked past him toward the road. "Mr. Hargrove's been eyeing that land of yours for a while now. Always thought it'd be better folded into something bigger." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "He's willing to make a good offer. Fair price for a piece of dirt nobody's been working." Caleb took the paper, glanced at it, then let it flutter to the ground. "I'm not interested," he said flatly. Royce didn't pick it up. He stared at Caleb for a long time, then gave a slow shake of his head. "You always were your father's son." He turned and climbed back into the truck. The engine started, the tires spat up dust, and then he was gone. Caleb stood still. The wind had picked up again, tugging at his coat. He knelt slowly, picked up a handful of dry dirt from the roadside, let it sift between his fingers. Then, with quiet resolve, he gripped what remained in his palm and held it tightly, the soil pressing into the creases of his hand. A deep, panicked bellow tore through the night, yanking Caleb from sleep like a rope around the chest. He shot upright on the old couch, heart pounding. Another cry followed, sharp, raw, filled with terror. Jasper, tied to the hitch post outside, neighed loud and anxious. Caleb was already on his feet, pulling on his boots without socks, grabbing the coat slung over the banister. Outside, the wind had turned colder, sweeping across the prairie with a dry hiss. He could smell it before he saw it, smoke, bitter and fast-moving. His eyes darted toward the barn, and his stomach dropped. Flames danced behind the slats of the old structure, orange tongues licking through gaps in the wood like something alive and cruel. The animals inside wailed, hooves thundering against the stalls. "God, no," Caleb muttered, bolting toward the barn. He didn't think, didn't grab a hose or a bucket. There wasn't time. The dry straw would be fuel enough to turn the whole building into a furnace in minutes. As he reached the barn door, the heat hit him square in the face, searing, thick, pushing back like a living wall. Still he plunged forward, arm across his mouth, eyes squinting through the smoke. The cows were panicked, slamming against the gates. He threw open the first stall, slapped the flank of a steer with all his strength. "Go! Get out of here." The beast burst past him, nearly knocking him over. He did the same with the second, third. The air burned in his lungs. Sparks floated around like fireflies, and he could hear the roof starting to groan. A beam crashed behind him, sending up a wave of embers. He flinched, but kept going. Then he heard it, a weak bleat, high-pitched and desperate. The calf. He turned back, following the sound toward the last pen in the corner, the smallest one, barely a few weeks old. It was curled near the gate, legs shaking. "Come on, little one, let's go," Caleb said hoarsely. He reached for it, but the flames had spread along the rafters, threatening to drop down. With one arm he hoisted the calf over his shoulder, legs kicking weakly. The smoke was a living thing now, clawing at his throat. He made it halfway back when the heat surged, and a loud crack split the air. Another bean gave way, slamming to the ground just feet in front of him. Caleb stumbled, the calf slipping from his grasp. He fell to one knee, coughing, eyes watering. He wrapped both arms around the animal and dragged himself through the ash and straw, barely seeing the open door. Finally, they broke through. Cool air hit his face like a slap. He collapsed just outside the barn, the calf still against his chest. Jasper was stomping nervously nearby, reins taut. The remaining cattle had scattered into the field, silhouettes against the flickering light. Caleb laid there for a moment, coughing, chest heaving. His shirt was singed at the sleeves, hands scraped raw. He sat up slowly, eyes tracing the flames as they consumed what was left of the barn. The fire had taken hold too fast, too clean. That barn wasn't just old, it was soaked in memory. Every beam, every nail hammered by his father's hands. And now it was ash. The calf whimpered. Caleb turned toward it, but its sides barely moved. "No, no, no," he whispered, reaching for the small creature. He held it close, but the stillness had already taken hold. One of his own, lost. And it wasn't an accident. Royce's voice came back to him. "You'll regret it." The smell of burning hay filled his nostrils, thick and bitter. He stared into the dying light of the barn, jaw clenched. That wasn't lightning. It wasn't negligence. It was a message. He stood slowly, boots crunching the blackened grass. Every muscle ached. The wind picked up, pushing the smoke toward the far fence. For a moment there was only silence, thick, eerie, the kind that presses in on all sides. Then he heard it. Footsteps, soft, receding, just over the hill. He froze, listened. Nothing, just the prairie breathing. But someone had been there, watching, waiting. By the time Caleb stepped into Maggie's diner the next morning, the place was already humming with the low rumble of voices and the clatter of silverware on porcelain. Warm light spilled through the large windows, casting soft yellow onto the checkerboard floors. The air smelled of coffee, sausage links, and fresh baked apple pie, the kind with a golden lattice crust that made your mouth water before you even sat down. He hadn't expected a crowd, not this early, not after the fire. Heads turned as the bell above the door chimed. Conversations slowed, though no one spoke directly to him. They just looked, some with sympathy, others with something harder to name, curiosity, doubt, maybe even judgment. Maggie appeared from behind the counter, a dish towel slung over her shoulder. "You look like hell," she said gently, wiping her hands. "Feel like it too," Caleb replied, managing half a smile. She gestured toward a booth near the window. "Sit, I'll get you something hot." He sat, letting his sore muscles ease into the vinyl seat. His eyes wandered across the room, farmers with sun-weathered faces, wives in plaid jackets, a pair of kids sharing a sticky cinnamon roll. It looked like any other morning in Dry Creek, but he could feel it, the shift in energy, the way people leaned closer, whispering behind coffee mugs. "I heard it was lightning," someone muttered near the counter. "Lightning don't strike twice in a month," another answered. "I say it was no accident," said a third, his voice low but sharp. Royce got his eye on that land. "Always has," Maggie returned with a plate of eggs and grits, along with a steaming mug of black coffee. She set it down gently, not meeting his eyes right away. "You okay?" she asked. He stirred his spoon through the coffee. "Lost a calf. Saved the others." She nodded, pulled out the seat across from him, and sat. "I know folks are talking," she said. "I can hear." "Let 'em talk," she said, firm now. They've forgotten what this land means to your family. Your dad built that ranch with 2 hands and a bad back. He never once took help from Royce or his kind. Caleb didn't answer right away. He watched a man in overalls lean close to his friend, whisper something, and both glanced his way. An older man at the corner table stood slowly, walking with the careful gait of age and bad knees. He approached Caleb's booth with a polite nod. "Morning, son." "Morning, Mr. Jenkins." The old man hesitated, fingers fiddling with the brim of his hat. "I was real sorry to hear about the barn." "Appreciate it." Jenkins took a breath. "Listen, I've lived in this town longer than most. I've seen what happens when a man stands alone too long. Royce, well, he ain't the kind to play fair. Maybe it's time you thought about selling, while you still got something left to sell." Caleb's jaw tensed, but his voice was calm. "If I sell now, sir, then my father dies again." Jenkins blinked, taken aback. The diner went quiet. Forks paused mid-air. Even the bell above the door stayed still. "I mean no offense," Jenkins said quietly. "I know," Caleb replied, his tone softening. "But I didn't come back to watch it all disappear. That land is my bloodline." The old man gave a slow nod, turned and shuffled back to his table. Slowly the murmurs resumed. Someone ordered another round of biscuits. A woman laughed nervously. Maggie looked at him across the table. "That was the first time you sounded like your daddy." Caleb sipped his coffee. It was strong, bitter, and exactly what he needed. Outside the window, the prairie stretched on, dry, golden, vast. It held no promises, only work, but it was still home, and he wasn't walking away. By midday, the sun hung high and mean above the prairie, casting sharp shadows and baking the earth to a cracked crust. Caleb wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm and squinted toward the horizon, where the faint glimmer of the creek should have been, cutting through the grass like a silver thread. But there was nothing. No shine, no trickle. Just dust and silence. A knot of unease twisted in his gut. He mounted Jasper without a word and rode toward the dry bed, heart pounding a little faster with each mile. That creek was no river, but it ran year-round, steady enough to keep the cattle watered and the land from turning to brittle skin. If it had gone dry now in early spring, something was wrong. When he reached the bend where the stream normally turned past the rocks, his suspicion hardened into fact. The water had been deliberately dammed. Logs, metal scraps, and sandbags, clearly hauled in by hand, blocked the natural flow of the creek. The land below it, his land, lay parched and thirsty. He dismounted and walked up to the obstruction, boots crunching over dry gravel. His eyes scanned the makeshift wall. No storm had done this. No accident of nature. And then he heard it, a low chuckle followed by the shuffle of boots. Royce Whitman appeared from behind a cottonwood tree, a smirk tugging at his mouth. 2 of his hired men flanked him, arms crossed, their faces blank as sun-bleached stone. "Well now," Royce drawled, "looks like someone found our little project." Caleb didn't reply. He kept his hands at his sides and took one step forward. "That creek's fed half the valley," Caleb said evenly. "You dam it up. You're killing more than just grass." Royce shrugged. "A man's got a right to use what runs through his land. And this bit," he pointed vaguely upstream, "happens to cut through mine first." Caleb narrowed his eyes. This isn't about land rights. It's about pushing me out. Royce smiled wider, like a cat stretching in the sun. I warned you, Caleb. Told you Dry Creek wasn't going to make room for sentiment. Without waiting for another word, Caleb turned and began pulling at the sandbags. The earth was hot and the bags were heavy, but he worked without pause. Dust clouded around his boots, his shirt clung to his back, and each breath tasted like grit. Royce said something behind him, but he didn't listen. That was until a hand grabbed his shoulder and yanked him back. He twisted, instinct kicking in, just in time to duck a punch from one of the men. The second came at him harder, landing a blow to his ribs. Pain blossomed sharp and fast, but Caleb didn't drop. He shoved back, not with rage, but with the sheer stubborn weight of survival. He wasn't there to fight, he was there to let the water flow. Another punch grazed his temple, and for a moment, the world blurred at the edges. But through it all, he held on to one thought. If I don't stand my ground here, it's over. With a final burst of effort, he pushed past them, pulled free the last sandbag, and the dam cracked open. Water burst through with a rush, tumbling rocks and debris as it surged back into its rightful path. It wasn't a river, but it was enough. Enough to wet the soil, enough to prove he hadn't given up. Royce cursed under his breath, glaring at the stream now spilling over Caleb's boots. You just made a mistake, he said. Caleb, blood dripping from a cut above his brow, met his gaze calmly. I've made worse, he said, but I'm still here. Royce turned, spit into the dust, and walked away. His men followed, silent. As the sound of their footsteps faded, Caleb dropped to one knee, breathing hard. The water ran cool past his fingers as he cupped some to his lips. It tasted like copper, mud, and victory. Back in town by sundown, word had already begun to spread. Caleb Whitmore didn't just survive the fire. He fought for his land and won a battle, even bloodied. Late afternoon settled over Willow Creek like a soft sigh, the kind that came after a long breath held too long. The sun had dipped behind the low hills, casting a honey-colored glow across the battered barn and the scarred knuckles of Caleb's right hand. Jasper grazed nearby, tail swishing lazily, while a few surviving chickens pecked at the dirt as if the fire, the fight, and the trouble that followed had never happened. From the distance came the slow rumble of wheels on dirt, and then the creak of an old pickup truck easing to a stop outside the main gate. Caleb stood up from where he'd been mending a cracked fence post, ribs still tender beneath his shirt. He wiped his palms on his jeans and looked up just in time to see Maggie stepping down from the truck bed, a wicker basket in one hand and a brown paper bag in the other. She wore her hair tied back in a low braid, and her eyes, usually calm like pond water, now held the quiet tension of someone who'd spent the whole day arguing with herself before making the trip. I brought cornbread, she said, walking toward him, and something for that bruise. Caleb didn't move right away. For a moment, the late light caught her face in a way that made him forget the dull ache behind his ribs. You didn't have to, he said, voice rough from the dry air and something else he couldn't name. Maggie stopped in front of him, setting the basket on the porch rail. I know. That's why I did. They sat on the porch steps, sharing warm slices of cornbread wrapped in cloth. Maggie handed him a small jar of ointment she'd picked up from the pharmacy, along with a roll of gauze. You should have let Doc Morgan check you out, she said softly. Caleb shook his head. I've had worse falling off Jasper. She smiled at that, but didn't let it linger. You could have been killed, you know. Royce isn't the type to stop just because you tore down his dam. I'm not stopping either, Caleb said, reaching down to scratch the porch wood with his thumbnail. If I back down now, it all meant nothing. Maggie looked at him for a long moment, studying the quiet fire behind his words. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she said, You're not alone in this. He turned to her, surprised. She rarely spoke like that, open, vulnerable. She glanced down at her hands, fingers twisting in her lap. Most folks may be too scared or too tired to stand with you, but not all of us. Some of us remember who your father was, what this place meant. Caleb swallowed hard. For a moment, the ache in his chest had nothing to do with bruises or cracked ribs. You ever think maybe you should have just stayed in town? He asked. She gave a half laugh. Every day since you got back. He looked at her, really looked. Beneath the calm exterior was someone fighting her own storm, caught between the fear of what Royce might do and the pull of something deeper, something rooted in memory and hope. As the last light faded from the horizon, they sat in silence, comforted by the simple act of being near someone who understood, even if neither of them said the words out loud. Later, after Maggie had driven off and the stars began to blink awake in the vast Texas sky, Caleb stepped back inside the cabin. He was heading to the sink when he saw it. An envelope, plain and folded once, lying on the floor just inside the doorway. He bent down slowly, picking it up. The paper was dry, but something brittle crackled inside. He opened it, carefully. A single, wilted white flower tumbled out, its petals curled and brown at the edges. Inside the folded note were 4 words, scrawled in blocky handwriting. Next time, no warnings. Caleb stood there for a long time, staring at the letter in his hand, then at the withered bloom now resting on the floorboards. He didn't move, not yet, but his jaw tightened, and somewhere deep inside, something cold and steady began to root itself. The Sunday bell rang out across the dusty fields of Dry Creek, its notes rising and falling like a memory being sung aloud. The sound traveled far, past the sycamores near the creek, through the fields still trembling from the drought, and finally to the cracked wooden steps of the little chapel where generations had come to pray, to mourn, and to meet. Caleb straightened the collar of his worn shirt, wiping dust from his boots as he approached the chapel. He hadn't been inside since before his father's passing. Now, with the church doors open and light filtering through stained glass in faded reds and blues, the place felt both unfamiliar and deeply known, like a childhood song, half forgotten. Inside, the pews filled slowly. Families with pressed clothes and sun-kissed faces murmured greetings. Hats were tipped, and children fidgeted in their Sunday best. At the front stood Pastor Miller, his white collar crisp against a threadbare black coat, Bible in hand, and sorrow in his eyes. Age had made his frame brittle, but his voice still carried, firm and warm like a grandfather's embrace. The sermon was gentle that morning, about forgiveness, unity, and the dangers of pride. It was the kind of message that could mean 100 things to 100 people. But Caleb knew who it was meant for. As the final hymn faded, chairs were pulled out, and the congregation moved to the side yard, where long tables were already laid with Sunday supper. The smell of roasted chicken, baked beans, and cornbread mingled with the dry prairie air. Women carried pies wrapped in foil, and men shared thermoses of sweet tea. Laughter rose above the food, though here and there were quiet glances, some toward Caleb, some toward the man standing across the tables in a spotless white hat. Silas Royce. He stood with his usual air, arms crossed, lips curled in the faintest smirk. The fire in Caleb's barn, the blocked water, the wilted flour, none of it proven, none of it spoken, but it all hovered around them like dust, refusing to settle. Pastor Miller raised a hand for silence. "Before we eat," he said, "I want to speak on peace. This town has weathered many storms, some from nature, some from men. Let us not become our own storm." There was a ripple of nods. Silas stepped forward, voice smooth. "Wise words, Pastor. But some storms roll in from the outside, uninvited, dangerous, reckless." Caleb's fork paused mid-air. "Some folks," Silas continued, eyes sweeping the crowd, "come back thinking they're still owed something, but all they really bring is trouble." Maggie's hand tightened on her plate. Caleb stood, slowly. The chatter died. "I came back because this land is part of me," he said, voice steady. "Not because I want to fight, but because I won't run from one." Someone coughed. A woman clutched her husband's arm. The cicadas outside seemed louder. Silas chuckled, low and slow. "So you say." Caleb met his gaze. "We all heard your threats. We all saw the fire, and when someone dammed the creek, it wasn't a mystery." "That's a serious accusation," Silas said, still smiling. "You should be careful." "I'm not accusing," Caleb said. "I'm stating facts, and I'm done pretending we don't see what's happening here." The silence after that was thick as the cornbread cooling on the table. Pastor Miller cleared his throat, but said nothing. Then, quietly, someone shifted in their seat. An older man, Bert Haley, who ran the grain store, sat back, looked Caleb in the eye, and gave a small nod. It wasn't much, not a speech, not a stand, but it was a beginning. And as Caleb sat back down, heart pounding harder than it had during the fire or the fight, he realized it meant everything. The sound of fiddles and laughter carried through the golden haze of the late afternoon, sweeping down Main Street like a breeze soaked in cinnamon and wood smoke. The Dry Creek Fall Fair had returned, just as it always had. Wagon rides, booths decked with burlap and sunflowers, and children darting between hay bales with sticky fingers and pumpkin-painted cheeks. For a few hours, the weight of drought and whispered threats seemed to lift. The townsfolk came out in their best denim and leather, drawn by the smell of roasted corn, pumpkin pie, and the promise of distraction. Caleb stood near the edge of the square, breathing in the familiar chaos of the fair. The clang of a horseshoe toss, the holler from the ring toss booth, the muffled thump of hooves over dirt. Maggie walked up beside him, holding 2 paper cups filled with spiced apple cider. "Smells like every fall since we were 10, she said, handing him one. Caleb smiled faintly. "Feels different, though." He was right. The air buzzed with more than celebration. Something underneath, curiosity, maybe even shifting allegiance, crackled like the crisp leaves underfoot. Near the main corral, an announcer with a voice like a barn door hinge called out the next name in the horseback skills contest. Caleb heard his own name and glanced over at Maggie, surprised. "You signed me up?" he asked. She raised a brow. "Dry Creek needs reminding of who you are." With a half-hearted chuckle, Caleb made his way toward the gate, where Jasper waited, saddled and calm. The challenge was simple, ride a short course, maneuver barrels, and hit a target with a rope. It was the kind of thing he'd done 100 times as a boy, but now the weight of every watching eye turned it into something else entirely. He swung onto Jasper's back, nodding once at the judge, and let the horse find his rhythm. He was smooth, unhurried, not showy like the Whitmore boys often were, but there was steadiness in his form, clarity in his turns. He roped the bale clean on the first try. By the time he tipped his hat and rode off the course, a ripple of applause followed him. Then came Silas. Decked out in new leather boots and a crisp white shirt, Silas climbed atop a borrowed stallion that didn't seem to like him much. He smiled too wide, waved too hard, and spurred the horse too quickly. His ride was flashy, tight turns, sudden stops, but he missed the rope throw entirely. Laughter stirred. Still, the real crack didn't come until later, near the pie stand, when an old woman from the next county began arguing over the weight of a crate of apples she'd bought from Silas's stall. "This ain't 15 pounds, she said, loud and clear. "I've run orchards longer than you've worn those boots." Silas laughed nervously, tried to brush it off, but others began murmuring. Someone else stepped forward, another customer, then another, all complaining about short measures, about prices changed after the sale. The whispers turned into chatter, chatter into disbelief. And there, in the heart of his own town, Silas Royce stood red-faced and fidgeting as his reputation, built on charm and control, began to fracture. Across the square, Caleb and Maggie stood near a booth selling pumpkin bread and homemade jam. "Didn't expect that," Caleb murmured. Maggie sipped her cider. Pride always trips over itself sooner or later. Then, as the crowd around Silas began to thin, a shadow fell across Caleb's shoulder. Royce. He stepped in close, his breath heavy with smoke and bitterness. "Enjoying the show?" he asked. Caleb didn't answer. Royce leaned in, low enough that only Caleb could hear him. "This ain't over," he whispered. "My brother's pride can crumble. Mine won't." Then he was gone, swallowed back into the fair's crowd, leaving behind the fading scent of sweat and sawdust, and a tension that no music could drown out. The sun sat high and unforgiving in the sky, pouring light onto the cracked dirt and wind-worn fences of Willow Creek. Even the grasshoppers had gone quiet, hiding beneath dry tufts of yellowed grass. The old wooden porch groaned under Caleb's boots as he stepped out with a cup of black coffee, still steaming despite the heat. Jasper stood in the shade, flicking his tail at nothing. The land lay still, too still. Even the birds were silent. That's when Caleb saw the car. A dark Lincoln, polished to a smug shine, rolled up the drive and stopped beside the porch without a speck of dust on its tires. Silas Royce stepped out slowly, a rolled document in one hand and a look of tired amusement on his face. Behind him, Royce, the younger, meaner one, remained in the passenger seat, chewing a toothpick like he'd been born with one in his mouth. Caleb didn't move. Silas took the porch steps deliberately, boots tapping wood that had once echoed with his father's footsteps. "I thought it was time we talked," Silas said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Funny," Caleb replied. "I thought we already did." Silas chuckled. "Not like this." He held out the rolled paper, neat and tied with a red ribbon. "This is a contract. A generous one. Buyout terms, clean. No tricks. You walk away with more than you'd earn in 10 winters here." Caleb didn't take it. Silas looked around. Look at this place. You've got a barn half burnt, a well that barely holds, and a herd too thin for the market. You're one frost away from losing it all. Caleb's eyes didn't leave him. And yet here you are, trying to buy it. Silas's smile wavered. I'm trying to save you from drowning. I'd rather sink on my own land than be pulled into your boat. Silas exhaled sharply. You think this place is worth dying for? No, Caleb said. I think it's worth living for. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of the porch boards under Silas's restless shifting. Royce snorted from the car. You're a damn fool, Whitmore. Caleb turned slightly, letting the sun catch the edge of his jaw. I've been called worse. Silas lowered the paper, his tone sharpening. You won't make it through winter. And when you're out here starving with a busted fence and no feed, no one's going to remember your noble stand. They'll just see another failed Whitmore, same as your old man. That hit like a stone to the gut, but Caleb didn't flinch. He stepped forward, took the contract slowly, then folded it in half without opening it, and dropped it on the porch boards. You had your answer before you ever turned off the engine. Silas stared down at the crumpled paper like it had bitten him. The mask of charm cracked for a moment, and a flicker of true anger showed in his eyes. You'll regret this. Maybe, Caleb said, but it'll be mine to regret. Without another word, Silas turned, stiff-backed, and walked to the car. Royce gave Caleb one last long stare before they sped off down the drive, kicking up a trail of dust that lingered in the air like smoke after a shot fired. Caleb stood there a long while, watching until the car disappeared behind the ridge. The wind picked up, sharp and dry. It whistled through the empty corral and rustled the brittle weeds along the fence line. A tumble of dried grass skittered across the yard like a warning. He turned his eyes to the barn, still half blackened from the fire. The fences, patched by his own aching hands. The water barrel, low again. The skies above were cloudless, but something told him the storm hadn't left. It was just waiting, and as he looked across the land that had raised him, his jaw tightened. This was more than a fight for property. This was about soul, about memory. About not letting greed pave over the bones of those who had worked this dirt before him. He didn't speak. There was no one to hear him anyway. But in the silence, even the dust seemed to listen. Snowflakes drifted silently down onto the sloped roof of Willow Creek, settling like whispers from a quiet sky. The first real snowfall of the season had arrived, blanketing the dry land in soft white. It was beautiful at first, clean, still, almost forgiving. But Caleb knew better. Beauty could be a curtain, hiding something far less kind. He stood on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool coat, arms crossed, watching the frost cling to the fence lines. Every breath came out in a cloud. Jasper's trough had frozen solid. The old horse stood nearby, steaming and patient, waiting like he always did. Inside, the stove crackled weakly, barely keeping the cold at bay. The pantry shelves were sparse. Feed for the cattle was running low, too low for how early in the season it was, and no fresh deliveries were coming. Silas had made sure of that. The supplier in town, long under Royce's thumb, had stopped returning Caleb's calls. The roads out were iced over, and the last time Caleb tried to get to the neighboring town for supplies, he found the bridge barricaded. Maintenance, the sign had said, though no work crew was in sight. Maggie came by every few days, always after dark, always with something wrapped in burlap. Sometimes it was a sack of oats, sometimes dried beans or salt pork. She never said where she got it, Caleb never asked. That evening, just after dusk, the wind howled like a living thing outside. Caleb was patching a broken window when he heard a knock. He opened the door to find Maggie, cheeks flushed from the cold, and a large man in an old canvas coat standing behind her. "Evening," the man said, tipping his hat. "Name's Parker. Maggie said you might need some help." Parker's truck sat under a tarp of snow, and in its bed were 3 bales of hay and a crate of canned goods. It wasn't much, but it felt like a lifeline. Caleb blinked, swallowed hard, and nodded once. "I won't forget this. You're not supposed to," Parker said gruffly, handing him a bale. "That's how neighbors survive." Over the next week, the wind sharpened, the snow deepened, and the nights grew longer. The cattle clustered tight in the barn, their breath forming soft clouds in the cold. Caleb checked them twice a day, feeding carefully, rationing. His hands were chapped, his knuckles raw from splitting wood. Some mornings he woke with frost on the inside of the windows, but he was still standing. One night, as another storm rolled in, Maggie stayed late. They sat by the stove, sharing silence and coffee. The glow of the oil lamp cast their shadows tall and flickering against the wall. "You're doing more than I thought anyone could," she said quietly. Caleb didn't answer at first. He stared into the fire, eyes heavy. "I thought I could take it all on," he said. "Prove something. But without you, without the Parkers, I'd be finished by now." Maggie reached across and touched his hand, cold fingers warm with kindness. "You're not alone," she said. "Not anymore." Just then, a sharp knock rattled the back wall. It wasn't a door, it was the barn. Caleb was on his feet in seconds, boots hitting the frozen ground as he ran out into the blizzard. Snow flew in his face, cutting at his skin. The barn door moaned as he pushed it open. Inside, one of the cows, Rosie, a big heifer he'd raised from a calf, was lying on her side, breathing hard, belly tight with labor. Her eyes met his, wild and frightened. She was going into labor early, too early for this storm. Caleb knelt beside her, hand on her flank, heart pounding. The air inside the barn was warm with animals, but the fear cut through all of it. He looked up at Maggie, who'd followed and now stood in the doorway, holding the lantern high. "She's early," he said. "And scared," Maggie replied. "Same as we are." Caleb nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. The wind shrieked across the open land like something wild and wounded. It clawed at the wooden walls of the barn, rattled the doors, and sent snow swirling through every crack it could find. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with breath and worry, but the cold still bit at the skin like needles. Caleb braced his shoulder against the barn door as it banged and howled, shoving it closed with a grunt. He dropped the bar across it, locking out the worst of the storm. For now, Maggie was kneeling beside Rosie, the laboring cow, her hands raw and trembling, but steady as she stroked the heifer's neck. Rosie's flanks were coated in sweat despite the cold, her eyes rolling with pain. A low groan rumbled from her throat. "She's getting weaker," Maggie said, her voice thin under the howl of the wind. "She's holding on," Caleb replied, crouching beside her. "So will we." The Parkers had arrived just before the worst of the blizzard hit. Mr. Parker and his eldest son, Eli, had brought blankets, hot water, and whatever strength they could offer. The barn had become more than shelter. It was now a fortress, a delivery room, and a test of every ounce of will they had left. Snow had piled knee-deep outside. The main house was too far to reach safely, so they'd chosen to stay here, huddled near the cattle. Blankets were strung up as windbreaks, and the old iron stove at the barn center glowed red with heat, stoked by every scrap of firewood they had. Magic's face was pale and damp with cold. She shivered under 3 coats, but she refused to leave Rosie's side. Her hands were numb, her voice hoarse from whispering encouragement, not only to the animal, but maybe to herself. Caleb placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You need to rest." "I will," she said, eyes locked on Rosie. "After she does." The minutes stretched. Rosie strained, then quieted, then strained again. The storm outside raged on, relentless. The roof creaked and groaned above them, but the barn held. And then, just as the lantern dimmed and the firewood grew scarce, there came a sound, a sharp, wet cry, weak but alive. Maggie gasped, hand covering her mouth. Caleb moved quickly, clearing straw, lifting the small, wet calf into a blanket. The little thing shivered, blinking at the light, letting out another pitiful bleat. "She did it," Maggie breathed. "We did it." Rosie let out a long, low exhale and turned her head, nosing the calf weakly. Mr. Parker smiled beneath his frost-laced beard. "Tough stock, that one." The tension in the room loosened, replaced by something like warmth. Not the kind from fire or blankets, but something deeper, earned through effort, shared in silence. They stayed that way a moment longer, just watching the new life squirm in its makeshift bed, the storm still raging around them. Then Caleb felt it, a prickling at the back of his neck, a sense of being watched. He turned toward the slats in the far wall, just between two beams where the wood had warped. There, through the blowing snow, stood a figure, still, silent. A man wrapped in a long coat, collar turned up, face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The snow twisted around him, blurring the lines of his features, but the posture was unmistakable. Royce. He stood alone, half lost in the blizzard, staring into the barn with an unreadable expression. There was no sneer tonight, no smirk, just a hard stillness and eyes like stone, their gazes locked through the storm. For a moment, Caleb didn't move. Neither did Royce. Then, slowly, Royce turned and vanished into the white. Maggie stepped beside him, voice soft. "Did someone?" "No one," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure. He closed the slat gently. Outside, the wind screamed louder than ever, but inside the barn, beside the sleeping calf and exhausted cow, something small but real had been won. The steady thump of the festival drum rolled across the open sky like thunder announcing the season's turning. Willow Creek's first spring rodeo was in full swing, the air charged with dust, laughter, and the smell of fried dough and grilled meat. Colorful pennants flapped high above the wooden stands, and the scent of cotton candy mixed with the sharp musk of livestock. Caleb tightened the cinch on Jasper's saddle, patting the old horse's side as the announcer's voice boomed across the rodeo grounds. "Next up, Caleb Whitmore of Willow Creek, riding old Jasper into the arena." The crowd responded with a mixture of cheers and curious murmurs. Some clapped out of loyalty, others watched out of doubt. Caleb was still the boy who had returned to a man's burden, and not everyone was sure he belonged in either role yet. From the stands, Maggie leaned forward, hands wrapped around a cup of lemonade. Her eyes didn't waver. Caleb rode out into the open field, dust kicking up behind Jasper's hooves. The wind caught his hat, his coat flapped with each movement, and for a moment he looked just like his father had on the same ground many years ago. He didn't go for flash. He didn't need to. Jasper knew him like breath knew lungs, and together they moved with a quiet confidence, controlled turns, sharp stops, quick cuts around barrels. Nothing fancy, just pure practiced skill. The crowd leaned in, the noise rose, and when he slid into the final stop, raising one fist to the sky, the stands erupted. Silas sat near the judge's booth, jaw tight. His own horse, a sleek black mare, waited at the gate. He stood, adjusted his gloves, and mounted up. The announcer's voice followed. "Silas Gentry, next rider." Silas galloped into the ring like a man claiming territory. He was good, no one doubted that. His turns were quick, almost too quick. His rope work, sharp. But there was something off. Caleb noticed it first. One of the barrels had been shifted slightly before Silas's run, just enough to shorten the curve. Then Maggie saw it too. Near the judge's table, one of Royce's men, the same who'd blocked the stream weeks ago, gave a quiet nod. Silas flew past the adjusted barrel, shaving seconds off his time. When he dismounted, the judges began comparing notes. One read off the score, higher than Caleb's. The crowd applauded, but it was thinner now. Unease hung in the air like dust that refused to settle. Maggie stood up. "Wait," she called out. The voices quieted. "I saw someone move that barrel," she said, pointing, "before Silas rode." "That's not regulation." Gasps rose. Whispers turned into sharp, questioning stares. The judges looked at each other. One of them, the old man with the bolo tie, stood up, face flushed. "Is this true?" he asked. Royce shifted in his seat but said nothing. Silas's face hardened. "Are you accusing me of cheating?" he spat, stepping toward Maggie. She didn't back down. Her voice was steady. "I'm saying if you won, it wasn't fair, and you know it." The silence was loud. Every pair of eyes locked onto Silas, who looked suddenly very small despite his height. A moment later, one of the judges walked to the field, knelt beside the barrel, and measured the track with his stick. "It's off," he confirmed, "by nearly a foot." The murmurs turned to a low roar. Silas's face turned the color of ash. He turned without a word, shoved through the crowd, and disappeared behind the arena. Royce remained seated, jaw tight, watching. Caleb approached Maggie, tipping his hat. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she said, her voice low. "Truth matters." They stood in the open, the sunlight catching the dust in golden halos, the drumbeat now replaced by the buzz of voices. Behind them, food stalls sizzled and popped. Corn dogs, chili bowls, sweet cider. Children ran past, waving flags, too young to know what had just happened, too free to care. But the adults, they were watching, and this time, they were watching Caleb with something new in their eyes. The moon hung low over Willow Creek, its pale light barely strong enough to silver the tops of the hills. Down in the valley, darkness pooled thick like cold ink, broken only by the shaky flicker of a lantern swaying from Caleb's gloved hand. A sudden crash of hooves shattered the stillness. "Did you hear that?" Maggie whispered, gripping her coat tighter against the cold. Her breath rose like smoke. Caleb didn't answer. He was already moving, lantern raised high, boots crunching over frost-bitten grass. In the distance, shadows scattered like frightened ghosts. His cattle, stampeding toward the far edge of the property. Another wild bellow cut through the night. Caleb cursed under his breath. They're panicked. The wind howled through the narrow canyon that cupped Willow Creek's eastern ridge. It moaned low, like some old spirit mourning in the rocks. The cattle would spook easily in a place like this, and if they scattered into the woods or over the bluff. He didn't finish the thought, he just ran. Maggie followed close behind, holding a smaller lantern that danced in her trembling hands. Her boots slipped more than once, but she didn't stop. When they reached the first clearing, Caleb slowed. The grass was torn. Hoof prints pressed deep into the earth like a storm had passed. He crouched low, ran his fingers through the dirt, then froze. A boot print. Not his. Too wide, too fresh. He followed them a few paces, heart thudding. They led toward the fence, then vanished into the brush. Just beyond that point, he heard a faint whinny, then silence. "Royce," he muttered. Maggie knelt beside him. Why would he come out here at this hour? To scatter the herd, maybe. Push them past the ridgeline. Could lose half of them in one night. Maggie looked down, voice tight. He's not just trying to win land anymore. He wants you ruined. Caleb nodded, teeth clenched. They pressed forward, deeper into the low valley, the cold air turning sharper, their breaths more ragged. Branches scratched at their coats. Somewhere to their left, a cow bawled loudly. A lost voice in the wind. They broke into another clearing, larger, edged by the drop-off toward the rocky creek bed. "There!" Caleb pointed. A cluster of cattle huddled near the edge, snorting, stomping, confused. Caleb moved too quickly, feet catching on slick mud. His boot slid. "Caleb!" The ground gave way beneath him. For a second, all he saw was sky and falling light. The lantern flew from his hand, crashed and went out. He tumbled sideways, scraped his arm against rock, and came to a halt just inches from the drop. Maggie was already at his side. "Don't move," she whispered, kneeling, hands gripping his coat. She pulled with all she had. He groaned, shoulder aching, but finally dragged himself back up. They sat together on the frost-bitten earth, catching their breath, the night still pressing in from all sides. "Thanks," he said hoarsely. "You're heavier than you look," she replied, half a chuckle, half a tremble. They stood again, slowly, and began ushering the cattle back toward the main trail, waving lanterns, whistling low, calming the herd. One by one, the animals obeyed, following familiar voices, steady hands. But just as the last steer rounded the bend, a distant sound froze them both in place. Hoofbeats, not the scattered thudding of frightened cattle. No, this was steady, deliberate. A single rider, moving slow and heavy through the canyon, like he wanted to be heard. From the shadows, a silhouette lingered beneath the trees. Royce, watching. His face was barely visible, but the gleam of his belt buckle caught a flash of moonlight. His hat was tilted low. He didn't say a word, just turned his horse slowly and disappeared into the darkness. The wind rose again. It moaned through the valley, winding between the hills, shaking the lantern in Caleb's hand. Maggie looked to him. "He's not finished, is he?" Caleb's jaw clenched. "Neither are we." The rain had begun in a slow drizzle, tapping gently against the windows of Maggie's cafe, like fingers drumming a nervous beat. Outside, Willow Creek wore a damp gray coat. The wooden sidewalks were slick, and most folks had taken cover indoors, leaving the streets empty and silent. Inside the cafe, the warm scent of brewed coffee clung to the air. A fresh pot sat forgotten on the burner, its bitter aroma curling into the corners of the room. Maggie wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, her eyes occasionally drifting toward Caleb, who sat alone by the window, nursing a mug that had long gone cold. The door creaked open, startling them both. A man stepped in, older, wiry, with a wide-brimmed hat dripping rain. He looked around cautiously before removing his hat and stepping closer. "You Caleb Whitmore?" he asked, voice low, edged with hesitation. Caleb nodded. "That's right. The man took a seat across from him without being asked. Maggie brought over a dry towel, then moved behind the counter, pretending to be busy, though her ears were clearly tuned in. The stranger leaned in. "Name's Bill Hargrove. I tend to spread out past Dry Rock Ridge. Never had much reason to stick my nose in another man's troubles, but something's been gnawing at me, and I figure you deserve to know." Caleb leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Go on." Bill glanced once toward the door, then lowered his voice. "Silas. He's been working behind the scenes. I was at the courthouse 2 weeks back, taking care of some water rights paperwork. Overheard something I wasn't meant to hear." Maggie paused in her cleaning. Caleb's grip on his mug tightened. "He's been greasing palms," Bill continued. "That judge from Twin Oaks, Handley. Turns out Silas has been paying him off. Plans to fast-track a claim that your father's title's got irregularities. He's setting it up to take Willow Creek, legal-like." Silence blanketed the cafe. The rain outside seemed to fall harder now, drumming faster on the roof. Caleb's voice was calm, but his eyes burned. "You sure?" Bill nodded grimly. "He offered me money too. Told me if I backed his story, that your daddy forged some paperwork years back, I'd get a nice piece of his new ranch when this was all done." "Why come to me?" Caleb asked, tone unreadable. Bill hesitated. "Because your daddy once pulled my son out of a flash flood. Didn't think twice. A man like that doesn't deserve his name dragged through the mud." Caleb stood, jaw tight. "Thank you for telling me. I ain't looking for thanks," Bill said, rising. "Just do what you gotta do." He tipped his hat to Maggie and slipped back into the rainy street, leaving behind muddy boot prints and a room full of heavy silence. Maggie came over slowly. "What will you do?" Caleb stared out the window, eyes fixed on the hills beyond town. "I'll take it to the people. If Silas wants to steal this place in the dark, I'll drag him into the daylight." Maggie touched his arm. "You won't be alone." But as they spoke, neither noticed the figure standing just outside the cafe door, pressed into the shadows where rain and silence met. Royce. He had come to town on some errand of his own, but paused when he saw the farmer enter. He had lingered, listened. Now his shoulders hunched under his soaked coat. Royce stood unmoving as the last words filtered through the old wooden door. "I'll drag him into the daylight." His face was unreadable, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his wet hat. Then he turned and walked off into the fog, boots leaving shallow imprints on the rain-slick boards, fading fast into the hush of twilight. The old brass bell above the town hall door rang out clear in the evening air, echoing across the wooden buildings and dusty streets of Dry Creek. Folks emerged from their homes and shops, coats pulled tight against the cold wind that slipped down from the hills. One by one they made their way toward the hall, drawn by rumor, tension, and something else, older and deeper, the scent of truth hanging in the air. Inside, the wooden hall was already aglow with the flicker of oil lamps strung along the beams. Their yellow light cast long shadows against the log walls, and the smell of oiled wood and damp boots filled the space. Benches creaked under the weight of farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk, most of whom had known each other for generations. But tonight, familiar faces held unfamiliar expressions. Caleb stood near the front, papers in hand, his jaw set firm. Maggie was beside him, hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Pastor Miller stood just behind, weathered Bible tucked beneath one arm, his gaze steady and unreadable. The crowd quieted when the heavy doors swung open once more. Silas strode in, flanked by Royce. The room tensed. Silas's boots echoed sharply on the floorboards as he approached the center aisle. His coat was immaculate, his silver hair neatly combed, but a flicker of uncertainty danced in his eyes. Pastor Miller stepped forward, raising his hand. This town hall is now in session. We've gathered here for clarity and fairness. Let all voices be heard with respect. Caleb took a breath, then stepped forward. Folks, I know there's been whispers, accidents, fires, storms, but this ain't just nature or bad luck. Someone's been trying to take Willow Creek from me, by force, and now by fraud. He held up a folded paper. This here is a notarized affidavit from Bill Hargrove. Says he was approached by Silas, offered money to lie in court. Says Silas bribed Judge Hanley to declare my father's land deed invalid. A low murmur spread through the crowd like a ripple on water. Eyes turned towards Silas. Silas didn't flinch. He stepped forward, voice cold and smooth. That's slander. Any man with a grudge can write up a lie and sign it. You have no proof. Royce stepped closer, face hard. This is a trap. They're spinning stories. Enough! Pastor Miller's voice cut through like a blade. Let the people speak. An older woman in the crowd stood. I've lived here 40 years. I watched Thomas Whitmore build that ranch with his bare hands. I don't believe he'd forge a thing. Another man called out. My nephew worked for Royce, said he saw strange ledgers, told me he didn't trust what was going on. Royce's jaw clenched, and for a moment it looked like he might lunge forward, but Pastor Miller stepped between them. We've had enough secrets, enough fires in the night. This town was built on truth and grit, not fear and money, the pastor said, his voice steady. If Caleb brings forward evidence, we listen. We don't sweep it under the rug because Silas holds sway. A hush fell again. Silas's face had gone pale. His hand trembled slightly at his side. You can all chase ghosts if you like, he said, voice thinner now. But you're making a mistake. Then, without waiting for a reply, he turned sharply and walked out of the hall. The doors swung closed behind him with a thud that seemed to suck the air from the room. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the whispers began, quiet at first, then louder. Maybe the boy's right. Did you see Silas's face? He never denied it straight. Caleb stood still, heart pounding not with triumph but with a strange ache. It wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. The truth was out. And for the first time in a long while, the town seemed to be listening. Outside, the wind howled low through the gaps in the old boards, rattling the windows like bones. But inside the town hall, the storm had passed, at least for tonight. The first light of morning stretched across the open plains of Willow Creek, casting long golden rays through the tall grass and over the weathered fence posts. The sky was wide and clear, painted soft with strokes of lavender and pale orange, the kind of sky that whispered promises of better days. A thin mist rose from the ground, curling like breath from the land itself. Caleb stood near the barn's charred remains, boots planted firm in the dew-soaked soil. His hands were rough and blistered, but his eyes were calm. The land felt different today, not lighter but less heavy, as if the past had finally loosened its grip. Then came the sound. Voices, wheels crunching over gravel, footsteps. He turned to see a wagon pulling in from the road. Behind it, another, and then more. Men and women from Dry Creek, bundled in coats and scarves, some still yawning, others smiling with quiet purpose. The Parker family led the way, carrying wooden planks and coils of rope. Maggie walked beside them, balancing a tin kettle under one arm, her braid tucked into a shawl. She caught Caleb's gaze and smiled, not wide, but warm. You didn't think we'd let you fix all this alone, did you? She called. Caleb opened his mouth, but no words came. Instead, he nodded, heart thudding like a drum. Where do you want the beams? Someone shouted. Got nails and hammers in the wagon. Tom used to plant squash right near that patch. We could turn it over again this spring. The yard erupted into motion. Folks moved like water, pouring into place, lifting timbers, clearing debris, digging channels where the dry ditch once ran. The Parker boys hauled buckets, their cheeks red from the cold. Maggie and 2 other women set up a table with coffee and sweet cornbread. The smell of earth, sawdust, and fresh brewed coffee mingled in the crisp air. Caleb worked too, shoulder to shoulder with the men who'd once doubted him. He held ladders steady, measured boards, even laughed when young Billy Parker dropped a nail pouch on his foot and danced a little jig in pain. But it wasn't the work that choked him. It was the sound of it all. The hammering, the chatter, the occasional burst of laughter. The way Maggie handed him a tin cup without saying a word, just a look. The way old Mr. Cranston patted him on the back like he had his own son standing there. He wiped his face, unsure if it was sweat or something else, maybe both. As the sun climbed higher, the new barn walls began to rise, plank by plank. The irrigation ditch flowed again, its trickle growing stronger with each bucket tossed. Children chased each other across the yard, kicking up dust and giggles. For the first time in a long while, Caleb didn't feel like he was carrying the weight alone. Midday, while Maggie poured coffee into tin mugs, Parker leaned in and whispered something. Her smile faded just a bit, and she walked to where Caleb stood overseeing the roof beams. "News came through," she said, voice low. "Silas put the rest of his land up for sale this morning. Folks say he's leaving town." Caleb didn't react right away. He looked out toward the horizon, where the hills rolled like sleeping giants beneath the sky. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the tall grass. "Maybe he finally realized you can't own a place you never loved," he said. Maggie placed a hand on his arm. "Or maybe he saw what it means to belong somewhere." He didn't answer, but he felt it, that shift inside him, like something had broken loose, something heavy that had lived in his chest since the day he buried his father. The wind carried the sound of hammers, the laughter of children, the lowing of cattle. Life, pulsing again through the bones of Willow Creek. And in that moment, Caleb knew this land didn't need a savior. It just needed someone to stay. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills, casting long, golden shadows across the reborn fields of Willow Creek. Grass, fresh and green, swayed gently in the breeze, and the scent of warm earth mingled with the faint sweetness of spring blossoms. On the highest rise of the land, where the prairie met the sky, Caleb stood alone. Just him, the wind, and the land his father once walked. He wore his father's old hat, weathered and bent at the brim, the one that had hung by the door for years. His boots, scuffed and muddy, pressed firm into the soil he'd fought to keep. He took a long breath and closed his eyes. Below him, life bustled. Children raced across the open yard, chasing a dog that barked joyfully. Women laid out pies and roasted chicken on makeshift tables, their laughter lifting into the air. Men leaned on fence posts, talking low and nodding toward the new barn, its frame sturdy and proud, a testament to hands and hearts that had come together. Maggie moved among them, sleeves rolled up, apron dusted with flour, face glowing with something more than the sun. She looked up toward the hill, and when their eyes met, she raised a hand. Caleb lifted his in return, something warm sparking deep inside him. He looked back out over the land, remembering how it had felt that first day, lonely, broken, haunted. Now it pulsed with breath and purpose. A soft gust brushed past him, ruffling his shirt, and for a moment it felt like something more than wind. "You did good, son." The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't even real. not in the way things are usually real. But Caleb heard it just the same, low, steady, filled with pride. Thomas Whitmore's voice carried on the breeze like a prayer. Caleb didn't cry. He didn't need to. He just stood there, heart full, eyes fixed on the horizon. He thought of everything: the fire, the flood, the long nights of doubt. He thought of Royce's threats, Silas's schemes, the townspeople's whispers. All of it felt distant now, like storm clouds long since past. What remained was clearer, sharper. Roots, not just in the soil beneath his boots, but in the people who'd shown up when he had nothing left. In Maggie's quiet strength, in the laughter of children chasing wind, in the barn they'd rebuilt together, nail by nail, in the love that had grown slowly, like spring after a long winter. Down below, Maggie was walking up the hill, steps steady, eyes never leaving his. When she reached him, she didn't speak. She simply took his hand, warm and solid in his. They stood side by side as the sky turned a deeper gold, shadows stretching like ribbons across the plain. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked softly, eyes still on the horizon. "Every day," he replied, then smiled. But only at first. She squeezed his hand. And now? He looked out at Willow Creek, the fence lines, the barn, the people. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Behind them, laughter swelled. A guitar strummed low. Someone called out his name, followed by more voices, inviting, welcoming. He turned, ready to head down, but paused just once more. The wind stirred again. "This is yours now." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Caleb Whitmore straightened his shoulders, the prairie at his back, the future ahead. He walked down the hill with Maggie by his side, back toward the ranch, the people, and the life he'd chosen, not inherited, but earned. And as the sky deepened into evening and the first stars blinked awake, the wind kept moving, quiet, steady, and full of stories yet to be told. Sometimes it's not about how much land you own, but how deeply you're rooted in it. Caleb's journey wasn't just about saving a ranch. It was about preserving legacy, honoring his father's voice, and standing tall in a world that wanted him to fold. In life, we're often tempted to give up when things get hard, but maybe the real inheritance isn't land or money. It's grit, resilience, and the quiet courage to keep going when no one believes in you. True strength isn't loud. It's in the silence of someone who refuses to quit. What would you fight to protect, even if the odds were against you? If this story moved you, type 1 in the comments. Where are you watching from? Let us know your state down below. Have a different take on this story? Drop it in the comments. And if you love heartfelt stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to @KindnessAudio so you never miss the next chapter.